Hi ladies, I plan to cover some of the key points of this week's chapter on constructionism. And it is actually a model that I like very much and use in research. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means and how it applies to our teaching. So constructivism or constructionism is really not a theory, but it's a philosophical explanation about how people learn. It really talks about that we construct our own reality, and in terms of learning that each individual constructs their own learning based on their previous experience, the context in which the learning is occurring, and their own mental processes are how we construct learning. So the premise is that different people learn different things based on their experience, based on their skill, rather than based on what you're teaching them. So you need to be cognizant of who they are and the context in which you're teaching. So those theorists, or that philosophy of constructivism or constructionism, really talks about there's more than one version of the truth. And so if I experience something as being true, that makes it true, whether or not you experience the same thing as being true. Therefore, learning is situated in the context and with the people that you're creating the learning or that you're teaching. Some of the assumptions about constructivism: again, it highlights the interaction between people and their situations in both the acquisition and the refinement of skills and knowledge. That people really are active learners, and they have to construct knowledge for themselves rather than, let's say, in behaviorism, they're just responding to stimuli or to the reinforcement of their responses. That they really have to create their own knowledge and make sense of the information that they're gathering for themselves. So teachers in this model can structure situations so that learners become actively involved in the content, and teachers can do this through the manipulation of the materials and through social interaction that they create and allow in the classroom. So some activities that will help that include having students observe different phenomena, collect data, and then generate and test hypotheses about whether or not what they think will happen or what they predict will happen, working cooperatively with other people. Some classes who use this model would visit sites outside of the classroom. So I think one of the examples that we had, instead of teaching students about how to use a map or about the particular phases or skills of using a map, you would take the class outside and let them use the map to find something. Or for instance, in social work, sometimes rather than talking to students about what some of the challenges of clients might be, you can have social work students go and try to make an appointment across town at a certain time and let them see how long it takes via the bus route to do that. And that way they get a greater truth about what that challenge might be for their clients. Different teachers from different disciplines may plan curriculum together so that the whole begins to make sense for students. In this model, you would teach students to be self-regulated learners by having them set goals, and then they can really do some self-regulation of their learning and go beyond the basic requirements of what you're teaching to explore their own interests. So making it relevant for them and making it so that they get to discover the knowledge and the learning for themselves rather than just memorizing or regurgitating. So there are 3 perspectives on constructivism. The first is exogenous constructivism, and this is defined as the acquisition of knowledge represents a reconstruction of structures that exist in the external world. So you see something that exists in the external world, and you how you capture it in your mind is a reconstruction of what you see. So this view gives strong influence to the external world by experiences, teaching, and exposure to models. Knowledge is accurate to the extent that it reflects the reality of that external world. So contemporary information processing theories reflect this notion. When we talked about cognitive processing last week, that reflects an exogenous constructivism, that there is a reality and that we reconstruct that reality in our minds. Endogenous constructivism says that knowledge is derived from previously acquired knowledge and not directly from environmental interactions. So knowledge in this sense is not a mirror of the external world. Rather, knowledge is developed through cognitive activity of making abstract or abstraction, and it will follow a predictable sequence. So when we think about endogenous constructivism, think about Piaget and how his cognitive development model fits into us building knowledge from what we've already acquired previously and relating new information to information we already have, rather than it being a reflection of the external world. And then dialectical constructivism says that knowledge is derived from interactions between people and environments, so that constructions are not bound by the external world, nor are they wholly the result of the workings of the mind. Rather, they reflect outcomes from the contradictions that the two create. So when our external world may not fit with our internal knowledge or processes, that creates new learning. And this is closely aligned with many contemporary theories, such as Bandura's social cognitive theory and other motivational theories. Situated cognition is one of the key concepts in this model, in that it says that cognitive processes, thinking, learning, are situated in physical and in social contexts, so that when situated learning happens, it's the interaction between the person and the situation. So really it involves, again, people learning, and they'll learn different things, but they learn in the context of their interaction with each other and their interaction with the external world or with the situation. So if they're learning in a particular context, it's either easier for them to recall it or be able to apply it in a similar context. And so again, this is where they talked about taking college students out to practice in actual environments. When we talk about mentoring, internships, We're talking about people really learning in the context in which they're practicing. So one of the theorists that they talked about in this chapter is Piaget and his model of cognitive development. He really was one of the first to talk about how really children develop cognitively rather than just physically, and he kind of modeled that after models of physical development. So he talks about cognitive development being dependent on 4 factors. Biological maturation, so certainly biologically and physically, developmentally, maturation makes a difference on how children learn. That it also depends on their experience with the physical environment, their experience with the social environment, and what he calls equilibration. And it's really about, those of you who've heard of systems views, that really we all have this drive to produce a state of equilibrium or balance between our cognitive structures and the environment. And so that is a motivating force behind cognitive development, that when there is not that balance, we're driven to a new level or new learning, new development to give us that equilibrium that we're looking for, that balance that we're looking for. So he says that this is a central factor behind cognitive development, and that this equilibration coordinates the actions of the other 3 factors: biological maturation, experience with the physical environment, and experience with the social environment. And there are 2 ways to achieve this equilibrium. The first is assimilation, which means you fit the external reality into your existing cognitive structure. So we interpret and frame things based on what already fits into the way we think. And then the second is accommodation, which refers to actually making changes in our thinking structure so that it can provide us with some consistency or balance with what we see in the external world. So we accommodate when we adjust our ideas to make sense of reality, rather than fitting reality into our ideas, or adjusting reality into our ideas. So here are his stages of cognitive development and some of the implications for education. So they are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. And you can see that we do use these in primary and secondary education in how we build on what we see as learners' ability or cognitive ability at certain stages of their development. So sensory motor, we see children's actions are spontaneous. They represent an attempt to understand the world, and their understanding is really rooted in the present action. They don't really see future. They don't really look at the past, but they are very much in the present and in spontaneity. Pre-operational are when children are able to then imagine about the future, reflect on the past, and even though they still are pretty oriented in the present, they're able to kind of look beyond that and make connections between present, past, and future. Concrete operational is really where children are able to begin some abstract thinking. Their language and basic skills accelerate dramatically. In concrete operation, children also begin to become less egocentric in thought. Prior to that, you see kids in pre-operational stage. Often they think that everything that happens to them is because of something they have done. They tend to be very egocentric. So if my parents got divorced, it's because of something that I did. Or if something bad happened, it's because of something that I did. Once you get to concrete operational, children are more likely to be able to see that other people may have motivations for doing things. They see that everything does not occur on the basis of what they have done or they experience. And then in formal operations, language and basic skills accelerate dramatically. Children begin to show abstract thinking, although that thinking is defined by property or action. So, for instance, honesty is returning money to the person who lost it in that kind of formal operational mode. And that goes from 11 to adult. So how this has implication for learning is that as teachers, and for those of us, I'm speaking to all three of us, we're really teaching adults. So we don't have to worry so much about the prior phases unless you think somebody got stuck. But it does require that as teachers you understand where people are in terms of their cognitive development. Also that as part of learning, in the constructivist view, you need to keep students active. They need to be active participants as they are actively constructing knowledge. That one of the things you can do is create this kind of incongruity or conflict or schism, because that, according to Piaget, is what drives or motivates people is to recreate some balance. So when you create incongruity, it motivates people to gain the knowledge they need to recreate that kind of balance. And then we need to provide social interaction because people learn in context and in a social environment, in social interactions. So Bruner had a cognitive growth theory. And basically, Bruner says knowledge can be represented in different ways. It can be represented inactively, which would involve motor responses, ways that people learn to manipulate the environment. Iconic refers to action-free mental images, that children particularly acquire the capability to think about objects that are not physically present by creating mental images of those objects. So I thought of the example of, when you're teaching children about animals, you often teach them in terms of sounds and pictures, and then they know a cow because a cow moves and a cow is black and white. So these mental images are how they learn. And then finally symbolic, when you're able to use symbols, including language, math notations, etc., to code the knowledge, so that you no longer just need a picture or a mental image. You no longer need to have touch or mental or motor responses, but you create knowledge with symbols. And again, mostly that's about language. The other major addition that he adds is that in order for learning to really happen at a depth that you want it to, you continue to present learning in these different forms at different times as children are able to grasp it as they move forward in their development. So you revisit content based on development, and he calls this spiral curriculum, so that you start off, with young children, you start teaching in one way using an active kind of learning, and then you revisit those same pieces of knowledge in other ways as those kids develop. So that I thought was interesting. Gotsky's sociocultural theory really is that dialectical constructivism. He sees that social interactions are critical in building knowledge, and that really knowledge is built in that interaction. He also talks about self-regulation of learning being developed through internalizing actions and operations that occur in social interactions. He talks about human development occurring through the cultural transmission of tools, including language and symbols, kind of that third piece of Bruner's cognitive theory, so that we know about certain things because it's culturally transmitted to us, and that may not have been culturally transmitted to other people. There was a lot of criticism in the 70s and 80s, particularly around the use of standardized testing to judge or evaluate intellectual capacity, such as IQ testing, which was done a lot more, even some of the standardized tests in terms of SATs and GREs. And the criticism was that much of the information that we are measuring and saying has to do with your intellect really is culturally transmitted information, and we are not taking into account in these standardized tests how culture bound the information we're asking for really is. So this is a great example of Gotsky's theory about how learning happens, and then how you can evaluate how learning happens, because it is culturally bound. Language, therefore, is a critical tool in transmitting or translating information and helping people to convert those symbols through language into understanding about concepts and ideas and theories. He also talks about what we'll get to in a minute, the use of language developing from social speech, our interaction with each other and understanding what those things mean, to private speech, and then converting it to inner speech. And again, this is about the self-regulation of learning. And then he talks about the zone of proximal development, ZPD. And it's the difference between what children can do on their own and what they can do with the assistance from others. So there's a level at which children have learned by themselves, or have learned a certain thing already and can't go beyond without the help of someone else. That someone else could be a peer, that someone else could be a teacher or a parent, but it's the zone or the space where that child moves from where they are to where they can be with the help of somebody else, and with the social interaction that comes with learning with others. So it really focuses on how culture and social interactions really shape what we know and how we learn it. Some applications of Gotsky's theory, and I'm not even sure if I'm saying his name right, but some of the applications of his theory have been instructional scaffolding, which is really how do you, in the environment or the context of learning in a classroom with students, how do you control those task elements that are beyond the learner's capabilities and kind of separate them out so that the learner can focus and master those features that they can grasp quickly and then add on. So they talk about scaffolding, like you put scaffolding on the outside as you're creating a new building or building a new building, and it helps to really structure the development of the building as well as protect it from weak foundation or just standing on its own when it's not ready to do that. So instructional scaffolding does that, and it has 5 major functions. The first is to provide support for the learning and the learner. The scaffolding really functions as a tool. It helps extend the range of the learner. So when you use scaffolding and you help students build on what they can grasp by themselves by just holding off the things that they can't yet until they're at mastery at that level and then adding on as they move. It helps to extend the range of their learner in terms of what they're able to then comprehend and tackle and grasp. It permits the attainment of tasks not otherwise possible because you're helping them with the building blocks necessary. And you use scaffolding, not all the time, but you use it selectively. So instructional scaffolding is one way that we use that zone of proximal learning to help students. Reciprocal teaching is another application of his theory. Again, that learning is really a construction that happens in a social interaction. So you would model, I'll use that term, model or teach what you're doing, what the activities are you want students to learn, what it is, concepts you want them to grasp, and then you allow them to take turns being the teacher. Because again, we talked about this before, there's different learning that happens when you need to teach what you're learning. Peer collaboration, again, we learn in a social context, we learn in a cultural context, and then the use of apprenticeships, internships, mentoring, where you have novices that work closely with experts so that you can bring them along at a greater pace than they could go by themselves. So a word about private speech and socially mediated learning. So private speech helps develop thought by organizing behavior. And then how much you use private speech increases with age. So it becomes more self-regulating and goal-directed as you use it more and get older. And it really involves the verbalization of rules, procedures, and strategies that improve student learning. And it allows students to construct their verbalizations, possibly in conjunction with verbalizing steps in a strategy, and helps them to organize it. And then they begin to take on what they've heard and internalize what they've heard. First by doing this self-talk or self-verbalization, and then once internalized it, they've internalized what they've walked themselves through. They no longer need to say it even under their breath, but it becomes internalized and they can just do it. They've just learned it. And then socially mediated learning is in that same manner that language, symbols, and signs are used to help students internalize what it is you're trying to teach them. You give students tools. You help them learn the steps, the procedures, the rules about how to learn the concepts, ideas, strategies, tasks that you're helping them or you're helping to teach them, and then you allow them to internalize these tools and use them in other contexts so that they can move forward in their learning. Additional instructional applications of constructivism. Peer-assisted learning. Again, learning happens in a social context. We learn from those interactions with others as well as in the context of our environment, and with a mind for, in terms of this model, prior learning. Peer tutoring allows students to be active in the learning process, both as tutor and tutee. Cooperative learning, again, that we learn in cooperation and collaboration with others, and Jigsaw and Stayed are two models that were discussed in our reading. Discovery learning refers to obtaining knowledge for oneself, that you construct and test hypotheses rather than simply reading or listening to a teacher's presentation. It's a type of inductive reasoning. Students move from studying specific examples to themselves formulating general rules, concepts, and principles. So I think there was an example in the book of discovery learning where you really put out what it is you want them to learn and give them some tools on how to investigate that on their own, either through questions or through procedures or steps that you might give them, and let them discover its meaning in the learning for themselves. Inquiry teaching is a form of discovery learning. It's based on Socratic teaching method, and the goals are to have students reason, derive general principles, and apply them to new situations. And inquiry teaching is really around not giving answers, but asking questions and developing good inquiry and good critical thinking in students. And then discussion and debate certainly helps keep students involved, helps them acquire greater understanding of a topic by hearing multiple sides of that topic. It allows them to understand there may be no clear right answer, but hear the thoughts and glean and take from those thoughts of others in coming up with their own answer. So those are great strategies for helping students to learn for themselves, to regulate their own learning, and to make their learning immediately applicable and related to prior learning that they already have. So in this kind of environment, you are posing problems rather than giving answers. You're posing problems and helping students to get at the answers themselves. You're structuring learning around primary concepts, but then you're asking students to build on those primary concepts. You really are seeking and valuing the students' points of view, understanding that learning happens in a cultural and a social context. you really are wanting to be flexible in your curriculum so that you can address students' suppositions and where students are and address where they are in your curriculum development. And then you want to assess student learning and really accommodate your teaching to what your students are learning and where they are in the learning process of what you're teaching. So because of the kind of environment you have to set up, given this active learning that constructivists really talk about, you need to do what they call reflective teaching. And basically, you want to take into account knowledge about your students, about the context in which you're having them learn, about the context historically that you're in, the cultural environment that you're in, the psychological processes that are required for what you're teaching, what motivates them, and knowledge about yourself. That all of these things require that you reflect on them and are thoughtful about these things in deciding how to teach, and that you are able to be again flexible based on what that classroom, what those students, what the context is. Again, it's really like situational leadership. You read your class, you read your students, you pay attention to where we are in terms of our society, our history, our cultural context, and you take all of these into account in your teaching. So you're sensitive to context, you're guided again by flexible or fluid planning. You need to be informed by your own knowledge of yourself and of where you are professionally, what your skills and your strengths are and what your weaknesses are. And then in that you want to enhance both your formal and informal professional growth opportunities so that you're up for the task. So I really enjoyed the chapter, and I hope that you enjoy the written activity that I give you in terms of reflective teaching. So with that, I will talk to you next week.